writers, agents, and publishers, for the first time since the Gutenberg Press, find themselves lost in a maze of mystery as technology alters the shape of the publishing industry. Searching for Answers is a group of writers throwing pop culture, writing, and publishing into a crucible of clarity, passion, and humor. This group is the Right Pack. In this episode, the Right Pack is going to explore genre mashups. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Right Pack Radio. This is your host and producer, and presently going insane, David Allen Lucas, voice actor and president of Winding Trails Media, president of St. Louis Writers Guild, author of various things. I write stuff. I'm stealing from Chanel. To make her say something different. I write stuff.
Actually, that
and
was
with that,
stealing from originally.
Okay, and with me today is my lovely co-host.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Kayembe. I have short stories that you can read on nightmare-magazine.com, lightspeedmagazine.com, an essay on okafrica.com, and I write romance under the pen name Kaseka and Vita. I also do editing and say snarky things that make people laugh and have to redo certain bits of the recording, but I'm not as good at that as Jen yet.
And to borrow from you, assuming you're not Congolese, how do you spell your pen name?
Kaseka is Kaseka, and Nvita is Nvita.
Also with us today is...
Hello, my name is Chanel Achan. He stole my thunder.
I did.
I write science fiction and fantasy and some literary stuff.
See,
stuff in there.
And also with us is the Sky Pirate himself of steampunk.
Yar.
Yes, Brad R. Cook, author of several things now. And you can find the Iron Chronicles, which is complete. It is a steampunk trilogy for the YA audience. You can find Steam Tree, which just came out. Steam Tree, the Ardranium Adventures. That is for middle grade, so, start off your youngins with steampunk early. And because it's now January, do be on the lookout for Tales of the Gearblade, which is my brand new one. And it is for adults and teens and stuff, older than 10. But check it all out. You can find the first chapter or the first episode of Tales of the Gearblade for free out there on my website and other stuff, bradarcook.com.
Excellent. And also with us is the Madame of the Western and of the Mystery herself.
Talk about mashups, yeah.
Exactly.
Fedora Amos, I write Victorian whodunits like Jack the Ripper in St. Louis and Mayhem at Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And coming hopefully in this year, but I don't guarantee it, is Have Your Ticket Punched by Frank James. I'm also president of Greater St. Louis Sisters in Crime.
Also with us is...
I'm Melanie Lucas, and by the time this airs, I should...
What? Sorry. You moved since the last
And Chanel and Kathleen just threw my wife completely off the rails.
Okay.
So
I'm Melanie Lucas.
I write stuff too.
You write stuff too.
Yes.
We all write stuff.
Yes.
It's all stuff in the end.
And today we're going to talk about the... basically the phenomenon known as genre mashup. But I'm going to point out to the audience and also to my fellow panelists, this is really not something new. It's come back, and I don't think it ever went away, but it becomes a question in our modern world of what do we do with it? It's out there like crazy right now. And how do we get it published? How do we get it sold in the bookstores? How do we personally promote it? Etc. And when I say genre mashup is not something new, I turn to Mary Shelley, who wrote, which by the way we had a great episode on. She wrote Frankenstein, which was both horror as well as sci-fi. You have Edgar Allan Poe, who also intermixed some of it, but who's known mostly for horror, but he also wrote mystery and fantasy, as well as poetry. So how do we do this?
Hi, my name is Kathleen, and I don't know what rap music or digital music is, so what is a mashup? Please tell me, for I do not know, and I am innocent and new to this world.
Okay, yes, and Kathleen is sometimes our comedy relief.
Jen's not here, someone has to cover her bases.
So, what is a mashup? Who wants to tackle that?
Brian?
Sure. Basically,
Resident publisher.
genre mashup falls into when two categories, maybe more than two categories, two different genres are put together in the same book. You were mentioning horror and paranormal. That's pretty standard. Romance paranormal is a huge one right now.
Yes.
I'll even throw out Steam Tree is a mix of steampunk and fantasy. It's a total mashup of the two. Whereas the Iron Chronicles is less of a mashup of fantasy and more of a maybe historical steampunk or something like that. If you're gonna call it a mashup, kind of deal. But basically, and this is really standard because a lot of us if you look at Firefly, which is a Western mixed with
Very good.
sci-fi.
Yes.
So you're taking these things and you're kind of pushing them together, but really we're not reinventing any of these genres. We're just sort of like branching out in the genre that like a sci-fi genre or a mystery genre.
We're finding
Something
ways to
along those
interweave
lines.
them.
But really, it's about having more than one genre in a story, and genres being the way we break up different types of books.
And I'm just going to point out that I'm going to turn to Chanel, who was first over Dovetail, then Melanie. Oh, Melanie was first? Okay, I'm sorry. An example of it, and besides Firefly, thank you for that one, Brad. In movies, another example, and this was horror meeting sci-fi, was Alien in the entire series. And with
Especially
that,
Alien.
Yeah, and I
Alien's a really good example.
agree that it's really old and it's never really gone away, but making unexpected mashups that are super popular and now easier to get sold, at least, or bought by mainstream publishers, I think can be traced back to 2009 book Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
Good one.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that introduced the classical literature or mashed up with horror. And in this case, and frankly, a lot of the imitators that came out after it weren't as good. But this one's really good, and a whole lot of it is actually Jane Austen's writing.
Well,
And they-
I don't know. That's sorry.
That you just kind of got to call theft, don't you?
No, she's
Why
on
not?
the title as the author. She's a co-author of this book. She got full credit.
Not a willing one, but still a co-author.
Yeah, and it's in the public domain. That's the point of the public domain. You're supposed to be able to do stuff like that. People do that with Shakespeare all the time.
And be happy the public domain exists because Disney's trying to find a way to destroy it.
Yeah, no, we still love the public domain.
Hey, Chanel and then Brad.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I guess, like everyone said, it's not something that is new or breaking. It's just that you could say that the necessity of defining these genres have attributed to the rise of the genre mashup. Is that fair enough to say?
Oh yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that.
And Brad.
If you had not had the dozens of places in Barnes and Noble where we all had to go and stand to find books, then we would not have the idea of the genre mashup. We'd just have cool books. But the reality is that we're all used to going to the sci-fi section or some other section of the bookstore, and somebody wrote a book that included more than one of those sections, and now we're all like, I don't know what to do!
Online selling, it can be in multiple sections.
But I'll throw out another one since we're throwing them out, and this is one of my faves of recent. It's technically a movie, not a book, but
We cover
Civil
all
War.
writing.
Not Civil War. Winter Soldier. Captain America: Winter Soldier. The reason I say that is it is a superhero movie and a political thriller, beautifully married together.
And might I say, most of your comic books are mashups automatically.
Oh yeah.
Every Batman, basically.
It's also a divorce story. Because Steve and Tony broke up very publicly over another man.
Okay, we're not going down that road.
No,
It's canon.
Yeah,
I
it's canon.
know. I just.
You can't really argue with that, can
But yeah, a lot of
Marvel's
superhero
awesome.
stories are totally mashups and stuff like that.
let's before we get too much further into genre mashing up, let's talk about what genre is, or rather, I'm going to call it the artificial creation of genre. And Brad, you were basically describing this earlier off mic, so I'm going to beg you to talk about when did the concept of genre really come into play?
Okay, so the idea of genre is a mixed bag of things. We've had it for a long time. We've had sci-fi and mystery and memoir and biographies and stuff like that for a really long time. Most of those were just called books for a really long time, and most of them got stored in the fiction or non-fiction sections. That was the big, break there. But somewhere around the 60s and 70s, you really start to see the 1960s and 70s, because I'm realizing we're not in the 19th century anymore, or 1900s anymore. But the realization that you had bookstores that needed to classify different sections. That people didn't want to go digging through a ton of sci-fi novels looking for a mystery novel. People didn't want to go digging through a ton of mystery novels looking for a romance. So they started breaking these things out, and that's where we got the notion of genre. Now it is the defining characteristic of our industry. So for those of you who don't know, there's these things called BISAC codes. And that is an anagram that I don't know, and I don't have my phone on me, so I can't tell you what BISAC means. But it's BIASAC, I think, something like that. But
People
anyway,
are on the
might
phones
just be
looking right now.
BISAC. Anyway, what these are codes that define genre that are selected by your publisher. So your publisher goes to the big ISBN agency which kind of holds all the metadata for books. Metadata being all the weird, things that define your book. Your ISBN number, your BISAC codes, your ancillaries, the stuff that, Fedora's always talking about. But anyway, a BISAC code is a way of choosing what genre your book falls into. So it could be that, like, Steam Tree falls into juvenile books, juvenile fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, books about dragons. That's one. Another one is juvenile fiction, science fiction, steampunk, historical. And so these are just a series of keywords that we call them that the industry and other people use to define genre. Now from that, we now have the ability to do all these tons of mashups. Like, it can be in juvenile fiction, it can be in science fantasy, but it could also be in juvenile, I have it in juvenile fantasy fiction, I also have it in juvenile steampunk, the Iron Chronicles, I know they fall into YA, so it's young adult, we're not in juvenile fiction, then there's regular fiction, and everything just gets broken up. There are hundreds of these codes. And that is kind of the modern way of defining genre. And out of it really lends itself to this mashup ability, because now I can say, this is a romance, this is a sci-fi fantasy, and it's also for kids.
I've got Kathleen and Fedora both, so Kathleen and then Fedora.
Are BISAC codes what are in the front matter of a book that says some little number and then it says a nonfiction dash memoir?
Yes.
That's what those are
Dash
called.
Those are-
dragons.
Whoa,
dash.
okay.
Yep, those are BISAC codes.
Okay,
Nice.
I was just going to ask that. Good looking out.
Yeah, and that is how Amazon and other people and online retailers know to break up where your book goes. And also Barnes & Noble, they know which shelf to put it on. That's all from the BISAC codes.
All right.
Fedora.
I'm going to wax philosophical here for a few moments, and I hope you will all forgive me if I don't make much sense, but I'm going to try, because I think we're racing headlong like a freight train into something that may not be terribly good. It is a combination, first, of the great explosion of technological information that has made information in general so easy to put out to everybody and so pervasive and so much of it that it is practically impossible to decipher. And so we have applied some codes to it, such as the BISAC code. which narrows it down and gives people what they like. And that, I think, is a problem. Because getting only what you like reinforces all of the bad things about what you like, as well as any good things there might be. So I think it is a very dangerous megatrend for everybody to do exactly what he likes and only read exactly what he or she likes, because it makes us narrow. Once upon a time, there were good books and bad books, and they had many similarities of any of the books today. They had bits of romance, bits of mystery, bits of emotion, etc., etc. But they were simply good books or not good books. And I think that exposes people to more different ideas, more ways of looking at things, and more sympathy for those who are not like us than what is trending today.
I've always loved the notion that a story is just one genre. That you only write a sci-fi story, or you only write a mystery or something like that, because to be honest, that's a horrible book. You know, you want a little romance, you want a little action adventure, you want a little mystery, you want a little bit of something in your books to make them interesting. Now, part of the reason why we've defined this is so that people can find books in bookstores. I mean, that's probably the number one
And
reason.
sell them.
Yeah, and sell them. I mean, this is probably the number one reason why we do this. But, and why we have such a mashup thing going on now is the notion of we've done everything. So the standard standalone sci-fi flick, that was done in the 50s and 60s. You know, if you think about Forbidden Planet, which technically probably, if you think about it, is a genre mashup of some kind. But that's, you know, the first big sci-fi epic movie. You know, in itself, it also has romance in it. It also has all of those things in it. However, nowadays, we look at something and we say, this can't just be, it's boring if it's just one genre. And if it's more than one genre, now I'm exposing myself to more than one audience. And that can be a really huge thing. And that was proven by Paranormal Romance. Because when Paranormal Romance hit the stands, no one thought it would sell.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not even lying. This is
love
so
that
good.
genre so much.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Here's the best. So the belief was that romance readers would not enjoy the paranormal aspects of the story, and the paranormal people would hate the romance. And there was this huge belief in the industry, especially amongst the bookstores, that this was the dumbest thing to ever come out of New York. And within a year, it was one of the biggest selling genres of all time, and still maintains its peak a decade and plus later, practically. Simply because they found out that this book was appealing not only to the romance readers, and not only to the paranormal readers, but it turned out that they were both getting something that in the book that was exciting, something they hadn't read before, something they weren't used to reading in your standard boilerplate romance. Suddenly there are ghosts and werewolves or, you know, crazy stuff popping up, vampires. It was huge. Everyone ran to it like mad. And so it proved the notion that you didn't have to focus on that one audience. And you can go out and find other audiences. One of the things I learned off pretty early was advertising the Iron Chronicles as a steampunk. I was like, it's a steampunk book. I'm going to advertise a steampunk book. Boom, done. I ran off and I advertised it to a ton of steampunk people. And then it was selling okay, and I was like, okay, that's cool. And I realized somewhere along the way, why am I not advertising this to fantasy readers? It's exactly the kind of book they would want to read. And maybe not all of them are huge steampunk fans. Maybe a few of them are. Maybe only a few of them have ever heard of it before. But guess what? Even if it's just, 100 people out of this brand new audience, that's 100 people who weren't in my other audience. And so that became a huge, industry wake-up call that books could be sold to not just one audience, but multiple audiences. Which is another reason why the genre mashup has become such a thing.
That just got me thinking. Harry Potter was one of the first children's books that was really heavily read by adults. That's not so much a mashup, though.
No, it's not.
But when it even put it out in adult covers, so the adults wouldn't be embarrassed reading what looked like a children's book.
Well, we've had a huge, YA has really redefined the way we look at reading.
And note that they don't separate things
No.
generically. They don't separate them into mystery
No.
or science fiction or whatever.
YA is a very unique, because you'll go into your
It
YA
is.
section, it has everything there. It's a very unique way of doing the kind of bookstore model.
Do you think that's going to change as the genre grows older? Because you had mentioned off mic that YA basically came around in the 1990s.
Yeah.
So I mean, do you think it's because there aren't as many YA books compared
Yes.
to everything else? And
Yeah, that's exactly why it's its own section right now. Plus, YA is defined by an age group, not a reading group. So the YA audience will read more than just one section of it. So a YA reader will read a YA romance and a YA paranormal romance and a YA fantasy and not think anything weird about that, because they're all written for their age group. So all the characters are their age, all the things that those characters are going through relate directly to the reader, and that became more important than, is this a mystery, is this a romance, is this whatever. Which is why, you really got a lot of mashups in YA. I mean, that was a huge thing, where you had mysteries mixed in with fantasies, where you have, the notion of the action-adventure mixed in with, something paranormal maybe or something. So it's just really opened itself up to it. And part of the reason for that and the success of it is that adults started reading YA. And partly that's just because they were really good books. There was no need to say, this is a book that's just for teens. Because if you think back about it, Romeo and Juliet's a book for teens.
bad
So-
decision-making teams.
Let me put us back onto a certain road here. Because what we've talked about is great, but I want to take us a step. And that is, I'm an author. I'm going to borrow from Rob Howell, who's not here. He's a guest. He's been a guest on here a couple times, and what he does is he writes fantasy and mystery combined as a mashup. He has, if I remember correctly, I could be wrong. So Rob, you can shoot me later.
Please don't shoot him. We like him a lot.
I think he has a ranger who goes around solving crimes. So what I mean by a ranger is borrow from Tolkien.
Okay, I was gonna ask. I was like, is this like Walker Texas Ranger? Or
No,
is
this is like I am Strider, and I am going to solve a crime. I am Strider who meets. My mind just went blank because I just couldn't jump the genre. Strider meets Sam Spade. I don't know if he's quite that way, but pretending I'm writing the book. Strider meets Sam Spade. Okay, how do I then go and try to get this published? Go ahead, Kathleen.
Well, I think you've already started that because you just said Strider meets Sam Spade. What I hear, and Brad, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that when you are trying to pitch a book to an agent or to a publisher, you want to be able to explain the book in a sentence. So
Yeah.
Strider meets Sam Spade is a great way of introducing a character and making it intriguing and interesting. And that's also a genre mashup. So I mean, if you have something like that, it would be good to have two different titles that come together that are themselves a mashup.
Okay, let me take us back. I don't disagree with you at all, because Kathleen, you're right. But I'm going to take you back one more step before that. I'm choosing to either send a query letter, or I am choosing to go to a writers' conference like Gateway Con 2018, and there's an agent, and there's going to be agents there. How do I know what agents or publishers to even bother querying? How do I go about it? I've got a book that I've written here. This is fiction, guys. I have not written this book. I'm just borrowing this from Rob. I've written a book that I've written. It's
Fiction.
Strider meets Sam Spade. That's the genre. That's the genre mashup. Where do I go? How do I do that?
You start with the web.
Okay, I'm on the internet. I'm on Google.
No, so everybody's got a website. Every agent, every publisher has a website,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to start there. And they are going to list what genres they represent or what genres they publish.
Okay.
If they represent sci-fi and they also represent westerns, then your sci-fi western might do really well there because they have the ability to market it in both places.
Okay.
Now, if you've written a romance paranormal, but this is a house that only does cozy romances, or like, some of the Catholic romances, or the Amish romances or something like that, probably not the best place for your book. And that's the good thing. And I will say, I threw out BISAC codes earlier because we were talking about them before and stuff like that, and they really do define genre. That is not something anyone listening to us needs to really care about. It's a great piece of trivia. It's great to know, but you don't pick your BISAC codes. Your publisher does.
Okay, but what if I'm a self-pub? What if I'm an indie
Now,
pub?
if you're self-pubbing, it depends. If you're just going through Amazon, CreateSpace, or some of those, they'll ask you to put it into categories, which is them kind of, stealthily asking you for your BISAC codes. Now, if you're like me, and you have Broadsword Books, and Broadsword Books publishes through Ingram Spark, and I've got my ISBNs through Bowker, then yes, I have to fill out my own BISAC codes and do all that kind of stuff. But really, all you should care about as a writer is knowing what genre you're writing in. Because you need to know that. That is probably the single most important thing you can know moving forward, is what genre you are writing in. Because everyone is that's going to be everyone's first question. The second question is, what have you written and what does it sound like? But everybody wants to know where to put this thing. Because do I even represent this? Do I even publish this? Is this something that I care about? Is this a book that I'm going to want to put into this section of my store? All of that is defined by genre. So just know what genre you're writing, the big one, the main one, and then know what other genres it might slip into. And never forget dogs and cats and animals. If you've written a dog book, that's almost practically its own genre. Like a book with a dog in it, yeah, that's like its own genre.
And I would add to that, it helps a lot to know what your publishers or any possible publishers for the kind of stuff that you're writing is looking for at that given moment. Yeah. I know I write Victorian whodunits, that I write historical mysteries, but I didn't know that I wrote westerns until I found out that 5 Star Cengage was acquiring a line of western mysteries. And I said, but hey, I think I write a western mystery.
It's just the Victorian era in the Old West.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the same time period, it's just in a whole different country.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to take this like a step back.
Yeah.
And somebody throw something at me.
Back.
Throw something at me if I'm like going out of bounds here. But okay, so we are talking about mashups and publishing. We're talking about mashups in bookstores and things like that. But let's go back to the actual writing of a mashup. Mm-hmm. Like, let's say, okay, I have this really great idea that kind of ties in Indiana Jones and aliens and a werewolf that comes in with a romance interest. When you're writing mashup,
I would too. I hope you write that. I hope you write that down.
I was almost about to say this was Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull until you threw the werewolf. So we're good.
I was thinking exactly that, which is why I had to throw in something weird. But when you're writing these things, do you write to the genre in mind, or is it like, you know what, that's a little too weird? Maybe I should take the werewolf out and just stick with Indiana Jones and aliens, or maybe just the aliens and the werewolves. When is genre mashing up too mashed up?
Okay, I don't know which one of you two were first, so I'm going to let you two find it out. Okay, it's going to be Fedora first.
I was going to say that I think you have to have in mind what you love and write that. And that was true if you go back to Homer. The Odyssey has elements of the paranormal, but basically it is an action-adventure story.
Yeah.
And one of the most famous books of all time, and not even a very long one, but certainly important at this time of year, is A Christmas Carol. And it's a mashup of paranormal plus a fable of all things.
Plus,
science fiction because it involves time travel.
It doesn't
fantasy,
really, but
because it does.
okay.
No, it does. We will have this talk. Off mic. We will talk.
sometimes I wish I would.
It's all a dream, yeah.
Sometimes I wish I would record Right Pack Radio after dark.
Off the button.
Off the
People
mic.
know this.
So, Brad,
Yeah, so I don't actually write to genre, other than I write steampunk. And, like, I know that I have to put gears and brass and bronze and, like, airships on everything. So, like, when I write to genre, that's how I'm writing genre. The rest of it, though, is just writing a story for me. Like, I realized a long time ago that I really haven't written much without romance in it. And though I wrote the middle grade and that does not have a romance, let's just be very clear on that. Though I did sneak a little bit in there, but not with my 10-year-old character. All the
Thank
adult
you.
characters. I am not Roy Moore. No,
wow. A
But
political
no,
statement
so,
I gotta flick in.
to throw it out though, I don't actually, but I do think about mashups when I'm writing. Like, so when I was writing Steam Tree, it was very, very, very much in my head that I was doing a mashup of a steampunk which is, you know, some fantasy totally, but it is much more of a rooted in today's technologies and, you know, this world and all of that kind of stuff. You know, a Victorian historical with a very clear fantasy novel where there are dragons and swords and castles and all that kind of fun stuff that you would see, and magical creatures like, you know, fairies and such. I knew all of that fantasy elements were going to be in this steampunk because I didn't get to put any of that kind of stuff in the Iron Chronicles. And I was like, Steam Tree is all about me having fun. So when I sat down to write it, I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew that I was going to be taking these elements of steampunk, the elements of airships, and, you know, the grungy kind of, you know, metals and fabrics and the Victorian era, and then very clearly merging that and mashing it up with dragons and fairies and magic and all the craziness of a fantasy novel. And when I put those things together, they actually worked out really well because they almost act as opposites against each other, which then creates conflict, and I got to kind of use use the mashup to create, you know, some great conflict and to create some great moments, which is what I think mashups are really good for.
Well,
I was just thinking the whole genre. One thing is you can write it and then figure out what genre it goes in, but I was just thinking that certain genres have much stricter rules than others. So romance writers in particular, romance books readers in particular, have some pretty strong expectations when they're reading what they know or what they think is a romance book.
Yes.
Number one, and first and foremost, they expect a happy ending. So if it doesn't have the happy ending, you can have a romantic element, but do not market it as a straight romance because you'll get a lot of mad readers.
Now, may I pause you for a second? Ladies and gentlemen, this is why I do not write romance.
Yeah. But for instance, mysteries. Again, if you're writing something and if it's a whodunit, there are certain expectations up there. One of them is that you don't find out who done it until very close to the end. Now, there's also the how to catch them and other things. So crime dramas is much more open than a straight whodunit. Mm-hmm. But a whodunit, you better follow this few rules of whodunits. Namely, you can't have you have to meet the suspect before you know who done it. You know who was who was the guilty party, and you have to reveal the guilty party at the last page or near it.
Okay, Kathleen, then Chanel, then Brad.
I am so glad you brought that up because I was going to bring it up, but you did. So let's talk about genre conventions a bit because genres have different rules. Readers have different expectations for given genres. Melanie has very well explained some of the romance genre expectations. And I saw a lot of purported romances when I was in high school that were extremely damaging because they had incredibly unhappy endings and they were all about a certain minority group that I am a member of. So I mean, like, if you defy certain genre expectations but still tout it as that genre, people are going to be mad at you. Also, you may be owing some people therapy bills. I'm just saying. it's your fault. So there are definitely rules for genres that you have to keep in mind, even if you're doing a mashup with something else. For paranormal and romance, you want something paranormal and you need to follow those expectations. And you also want to follow the romance genre expectations.
Now, you can't have a paranormal with romantic elements if it doesn't follow the rules for romances.
Yes. Yes, but like the fun thing that comes with genre mashups in that regard is being able to play with reader expectations and subvert them and use elements that are reader expectations for one genre in a different way than they would expect because you have the other genre in play as well.
Should know.
Kathleen took it.
Can I give you a different one to say?
Sure, just whisper it real loud.
It's
Real
from
loud.
off mic. You mentioned WisCon.
Dead
Thinking
air.
real hard.
The percentages of...
Oh,
There you go.
yeah. See, that's one of the things I was thinking about. I was told that if you're going to write a mashup, that it should be predominantly one genre and then have elements of another one or something of that, because otherwise you won't be able to get published, because you won't it'll be a conflict of what wins out here, in addition to your readers may not come away as satisfied. Like, for example, you wouldn't want a 50-50 mashup of two genres that aren't complementary, because then neither one of the audiences are going to come away satisfied.
See, I disagree with that. I can see why it'd be harder to get published, but I think both sets of readers might actually be very satisfied.
No, what she's
you
really
can't
falling into, and because I've heard that before actually, it's about mashups, that you should focus on one and add in an element of another, and that you shouldn't really add in more than one. You shouldn't have like 3 or 4 different genres mashed up into one book. However, I've heard that. I don't necessarily agree with it. And the reason I say that, and part of the reason I think they do that is exactly what we were talking about, is reader expectation. So when a reader picks up a book, they're expecting things to happen. And we've talked about the tropes and the things that can fall into this kind of stuff. But really what you're doing is, and what you need to make sure is that when you mash things together, you are mashing them in the right way. You're not destroying the one genre by adding in this other genre. We've mentioned having a romance in there. Yes, it needs to follow the romantic conventions. Yes, it needs to follow a mystery convention. It needs to follow those kinds of things. But you do get to play with it. You do get to mix it up. And in one of my books... okay, we'll take the second one, which is Iron Zulu of the Iron Chronicles series. That is actually a steampunk novel. It is a romance, it is a mystery novel, and it is an action-adventure. So it is 4 books all rolled up into one, and I did that on purpose. I very much did it on purpose. I knew for a fact, like when I sat down to write it, I'm writing a steampunk. Okay, that's the big overall one. That's the 40%, 50%, whatever. Cool. Next came the mystery. I knew that I wanted a mystery. There's a whole murder mystery that takes place in that book. And that was very much the whole second part of that's the second thing that falls into that book. But almost as big is an entire romance plot that is running through all 3 books, but very much takes is kind of rooted in that second book, which is where a lot of the decisions get made on who likes who and what happens with all of that kind of stuff. So that all played out, and it's all under this guise of this giant action adventure where they're going from England to the Zululand. So, in that sense, there are 4 genres in that one book. And I knew it when I wrote it, and people would probably say that I should have waited on the romance, or maybe made that the thing and not focused on the but to me, genres represent elements of stories. So, when I'm mashing these things together, it doesn't really feel like I'm mashing it, it really just feels like I'm telling a deeper, more well-rounded story. I think that's what the idea of these genre mashups. I think really all we're doing is we're just telling better stories. Because we are adding in things that people like a little bit of mystery. I could have written a MacGuffin. I mean, I could have easily written a MacGuffin. I mean, and technically I think there are MacGuffins. A MacGuffin is, sorry, I saw that, yeah. A MacGuffin, which we've talked about before, is a Hitchcock term for something that the protagonists are after, and it doesn't really matter what it is, if it's central to the story or not. It just matters that our central characters are chasing after said thing, or desire said thing.
Right.
So I could have written that easily, but I didn't want to. I wanted to write a mystery more. I wanted to add in those elements of mystery. And sure, the mystery gets solved like halfway through the book or something like that. So it's not your conventional mystery, but it's there, and it's very clearly there. And when I advertise it as a mystery. The first one is a straight-up action-adventure. The second one is a straight-up mystery. And the third one is your kind of internal journey. I wrote them very clearly that way. But those are technically just subplots, or, sub-themes running through the books. And I personally think that having a romance, having a little bit of mystery, maybe a little bit of paranormal, maybe a little bit of something else thrown in there, maybe even a little cooking book slide in the side or something, I don't know.
Recipes.
Yeah, you can throw in all kinds.
Throw in some obituaries.
Yeah, sure, why not, But the point is that once you've done that, you're creating something that's incredibly well-rounded, deeper, and your characters can then be more rounded and all that kind of stuff. So I think the notion of just saying, this can only be this, is kind of stupid. There's nothing wrong with it being a couple of things and saying, it's mostly this.
Fedora and then Kathleen.
I think the danger is that if you try too many different things at once, especially if you just chunk them without integrating them properly, what you end up with is something that's absolutely incoherent.
Yes.
And that is what a good writer is going to avoid no matter what. No matter how many lines of anything he or she has to work with, if you can make it all work out and not be incoherent, but instead be satisfying, then you end up with something worth reading.
Can I bring us to a film that was the first thing that I recognized as a genre mashup?
Sure.
It was 50-50. Right down the middle. Literally the first 50%.
That's the name of the movie.
I
I'm
thought
like,
we did
what
for
movie is this?
I don't remember that movie.
No, I thought you were going to say 50 Shades of Grey at first. I'm like, no.
No, please
Please
no.
do.
Okay, what is it? From Dawn Till Dusk?
From Dusk Till
Till
Dawn
Dusk
is
Till
the
Dawn,
movie.
yeah.
Ding, ding, ding. You got it right. So the beginning of the movie is, what is it? When you kidnap someone and you're pretty much a serial killer and a thief. That's the first half of the movie. And then the second half of the movie, the people who kidnap people and kill people go to this bar to just chill for a little bit, and the bar is full of friggin' vampires. And they have to survive until dawn.
Yep.
So these people who were definitely not friends are suddenly the only people who they can rely on to get them out of this place alive, because everyone is dying. So, it starts off one thing, and it completely flips its lid and goes somewhere else.
Halfway through the movie.
Yes.
Pretty much exactly halfway through the movie.
Awesome.
50-50.
Yeah.
Did they change writers or directors?
No.
What's his name? What's his name?
I forget it.
Rodriguez.
Tarantino.
No, Tarantino's in it, but I think
Tarantino's
it's
in it, but I don't
Okay.
think he was him.
Tarantino's a serial killer then.
Yeah.
Well,
In the film.
Oh, there-
In the film. So, yeah, that movie baffled me because I'm so used to the writing rules where like you introduce whatever elements you're gonna have that are gonna be fantastical in the beginning. So whether or not the main character notices them, the reader can go back and say, "Oh, that was a spell and I never realized it. That finger twitch right there. I see that now." But this movie, no. You have Salma Hayek being a stripper, and then suddenly she's a vampire, and everyone starts to die.
And can I say, we have often heard this advice. We have said this advice. Learn the rules and learn how to break them correctly.
But the thing is, I still can't figure if that movie broke them correctly. I don't think it did. Like,
Well,
it's
you're sitting here
classic.
talking about it.
It's classic, and there's a TV series that I've never seen about it nowadays. Now there is.
Yeah.
But like, I'm like, I don't think that's what you're supposed to do. Are they allowed to do that? And I still don't think it was right. It was fun, but like, one of those halves was not right.
I would interrupt this, but I'm rather laughing at the voice you're making. So
if your voice goes any higher, the dogs are any dogs there.
It can't. I have to practice. Oh, it did.
there you go.
So yeah, there are ways to do genre mashups, and what we're generally talking about in this case, I think, is genres that are like 50% one thing, and then a smattering of other percentages of other things.
Yes.
There is one dominant genre.
Well-
in this film's case,
Like
though,
Crime,
there's
Crisis,
no
and Zombies.
dominant genre.
But speaking, I have a hard time thinking of a sci-fi story that is just sci-fi. It's sci-fi it's always sci-fi combined with something else. Because sci-fi is just either the technology or the setting.
2001.
They had a mystery to it.
Really?
The book did. I won't say the movie. I wasn't talking about the movie. I was talking about the book.
Because I don't think
Yeah,
the
you got
mystery
the
really shows
obelisk
up in
and
10 seconds.
Exactly. You had
Yeah.
the obelisks and all that, and then 2010 was a
The
mystery.
mystery of the obelisk I might give you. But even that was just kind of weird in a space baby kind of way.
And then you had 2010, which was the obelisk, and what the hell did it happen to Hal? Yes.
Yeah.
Now see,
Well, we
that
find
I
out.
think is a bit more of a mystery. It's the mystery of what really happened out there. They clearly were trying to mash up a little bit. But 2001 is really just Stanley Kubrick being like, dude, let's get crazy and get in space and just have some fun and listen to some trippy music for a while I
And
give you some crazy
innovative
visuals.
pictures. I
Yes.
mean, that was amazing. What he accomplished in terms of cinematography.
And by the way, I'm just going to say it again. If you get confused by the movie, read the book. The book explains a lot that the movie's like just completely
Generally
glosses over.
Generally true.
Like, what is a space baby?
Yeah.
Well,
I'm not touching that because I could go so far, and I just need to not.
yeah, please
Um,
don't.
So, oh goodness, what was
Just
I going to
don't-
say
don't-
before I
and don't
got
have a chest
derailed by
popper over
space
there either.
babies? So are there? Okay, there we go. Like I mentioned with From Dusk Till Dawn, there was no bit at the beginning that told you perhaps the paranormal exists in this world. So
There's no foreshadowing of vampires.
thank you. That is the word. There was no foreshadowing. Whereas in the writing books that I've read, they'll tell you, you need to put in your beginning what your world is going to be like, even if the reader doesn't recognize it. So, like, with genre mashups, do you have to put in the beginning that there may be a romance later on? Or can you just start with adventure and mystery and then ease into romance later?
the second way, I think.
I think it depends. It depends on what it is.
I think that, especially with romance, like the audience expectations are so keenly focused. I mean, you throw a heterosexual male in a story, they're going to be on it like white on rice. It's going to be like, oh, is he? Yep, shipped. It's a romance, shipped. So, like, it's one of those things where it's like, I feel like romance is a little bit more forgiving in that way. Because anytime you have people that could remotely be attracted to each other, people are going to assume that they're going to be attracted to each other.
Even when they're not.
Even when they're not.
Can I just throw out that in a heterosexual romance,
Yeah.
a heterosexual male, like if it's a gay romance and there's a heterosexual male, I see heartbreak, or someone who's closeted, or just off the books.
Yes, true. You're very
Yes.
right.
A man can
Or the
be many
best friend of
different
somebody.
things.
Anyway.
So I was going to
sometimes
throw out
it's just
that
a
I think the question of how do you do the mashup comes into, and like Nora was saying, it comes down to the writer and how good a writer the person really is. Because the ones that always get me and make me groan the worst are the comedies. So it's comedy mixed with fantasy,
Yes.
comedy mixed with sci-fi, comedy mixed with horror, comedy mixed with whatever, romance, Sometimes it can be done very well. So, like, I've been watching The Orville. I don't know if anyone out there has been watching The Orville. It's Seth MacFarlane's funny Star Trek, bad Galaxy Quest. I don't know. But the point is that some of the episodes have some elements of humor that I really like. Like, the ones that I find the funniest are the crew who is either hungover or not in the mood to do something, or is like, what the hell did I just see on the giant big screen in front of me? What's going on in your background there? Things that I would expect, actually got said on the bridge of the Enterprise, they just didn't put it in an episode. When Worf is just like, what was that, Captain? Or something like that. Or Data's like, Wesley's sitting there like, oh my god, she has big knockers. Something crazy like that, but... That is hilarious, and that's when comedy can be done very well. But then there are other episodes of The Orville where it's just been like the comedy has fallen flat and just hit so bad. And it's like, when that's the case, now suddenly it's not a comedy. It's not even good sci-fi. I'm sick and tired of reading it or watching it. And it can be a horrible, horrible experience. In comedy, I bring out, and I'm picking on comedy because comedy can be done well and comedy can be done really horribly. Think about some of the genre mashups of, like, you know, the spoof films, where it's like a spoof on a horror film. I mean, some of those are funny and some of those are very bad.
And I'm just going to say, just fending it real fast, and I am extremely picky on comedy. I won't even talk about my opinion of Orville. And
We
that-
saw your opinion of horror.
Yeah, the
They were hand gestures,
panelists saw it.
listeners.
I will just say that okay, fine. I'll give one slight opinion. A friend of mine asked me to watch it. He thought I would rather love it. I watched the pilot. I couldn't make it past the first set of commercials before I turned it off, and that's all I'm going to say. I am extremely.
There
picky on
was some
comedy.
funny stuff.
But anyway,
Bits.
I am really, really super
Yeah, some
picky on
people's bits are
comedy.
funny.
The audience heard that about 4 or 5 times now. But comedy is also one of the hardest things to write of genre. So let's say that right there. And I'm going to shut up. Go on.
Can I give a shout out to some horror comedies that I think are beautiful and brilliant?
Heck yeah.
All right.
Buffy
So,
the Vampire Slayer? Well,
that's a Scooby Gang thing.
Can we call it early in the Buffy series?
Yeah,
Yeah.
earlier.
well, I'm thinking about the movie and then, of course, the early parts of the series.
Well,
Yes.
I want to start with films and then go to a TV show that Chanel and I have been watching that needs another season now.
Yes.
So Shaun of the Dead is
Oh.
wonderful, and the guys that did that have also done some other comedies with other genres, other mashups that have been pretty good.
Hot Fuzz.
Yes.
Yes.
God.
The Pub at the End of the World, or the end, World's End, or
At
whatever
World's
it
End,
is.
yeah. Tucker and Dale versus Evil, Cabin in the Woods,
Yeah.
which is
Yes.
very smart and hilarious, and also a freaking zombie movie that made me cringe. So good on that. But the TV show is called Stan Against Evil. That's STAN. Watch it, please. It is horror comedy about an old-timey sheriff that is a curmudgeon whose wife dies, and he gets fired for beating up an old woman.
At
her
her funeral.
Yeah. She was actually a witch, but everyone just saw him beating up an old woman. And the new sheriff comes into town, and she's a lady. That's so strange and newfangled, and we're in the future now. And it turns out his wife who died was actually like a demon hunter. Pretty much the only reason he did not die on the job is his wife being a badass. So suddenly the new sheriff and the old sheriff have targets on their backs, and they need to figure out what they're doing fast. And they fail, and it's beautiful.
It's fails so hard.
Oh my gosh, I've never seen a man more unwilling to save his own life by reading a book. The guy who plays Dr. Cox in Scrubs is the curmudgeonly sheriff, ex-sheriff. So if you like Scrubs, you'll enjoy him.
Okay.
Okay. And on that note, we will end this episode.
Oh, wait a minute. I have
Oh,
one
no,
more thing
we
to
have
say.
one more thing.
And it is Bread. While Romeo and Juliet are about teenagers, it's not a story for teenagers.
Let's hope not.
I think it's a fable, like, to warn teenagers.
To warn their parents.
It's
Yeah.
teenagers don't listen.
I understand that, but, you know, when I read Romeo and Juliet, I was kind of like, I don't think I want to die for that girl. And technically I ended up marrying that girl anyway, so I would, but the reality was at the time, it was like, I'm like, 17, I don't know if I'd really want to do
It's a
that.
cautionary tale,
It was
absolutely.
Yes.
taught my
The-
freshman year of
The
high
people
school.
that
Yeah.
needed to learn best in that story were the parents. So I mean, it's
Yes.
a cautionary tale
Oh
for
no,
parents,
the parents in that story were busy fighting each other to
which
death.
is why it's a cautionary tale
Yeah.
for them, because they gonna kill their kids.
You got it. And once again, on that note, tune in next week for yet another interesting topic on the writing industry. Thank you for listening. The new theme songs for Right Pack Radio were written and performed by Meredith Tate. All copyrights remain with her.